Yeah, thank you very much. Very good morning, Tan Sri Michael Yeo, President, KSI, distinguished panel speakers, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much to the organizers for having me to moderate this distinguished panel. I'm sure we will have very interesting discussions and insights into and forecasts into how the economy will perform. And we've had a good start, with Tan Sri Muhyiddin painted the background and the outlined the challenges and also how we manage the double crisis that we've had, not just COVID-19, which stayed longer than expected, and still lingering on, but also the flood crisis that we've just had. And the latest data didn't look too good. The quarter three, the recovery for quarter three was not as good as expected. And the latest data on the household debt also shows an increase from the year before. So these are some of the challenges. However, as mentioned, and I think we probably know that the Ministry of Finance still have a positive forecast on the economy, and of course is supported by the IMF as well and many other analysts, that the economy is expected to grow from 5% to 6.5%, and that's the forecast by the Ministry of Finance, and the IMF and the World Bank project for it to grow at 6% and 5.8%. But our recovery, as mentioned, there are lots of challenges, lots of issues out there. Unemployment is one of them, business getting on their feet, household debt, as I mentioned, but also on the demand side, whether the aggregate demand is picking up. So the optimism, with whatever type of recovery that we might face, really challenge this optimism. And this is coupled with the tensions, the regional tensions that we have, and now not just in the region. And Malaysia is an open economy with more than 100% on trade. Whether it will affect us, not just about US and China, but now in Europe too, that there are issues, and perhaps also a war, a possibility is there as well. So that somehow will have an impact on our, not just investments, but also maybe in terms of investments, it will reflect positively on us, but also in terms of our supply chain. So what will be the outlook? This panel, which is the theme of the panel, is Malaysia's Outlook 2022. How will our economy recover? And again, just to set within the plan that we have, there is the 12th plan, and it's going to be the third year for the plan, for the 12th plan. How are we going to achieve the goals that have been outlined in the plan? So with us, we have three distinguished panelists. We have Dr. Suraya Ismail, Director of Research, Khazanah Research Institute, KRI. We have Dr. Geoffrey Williams, Professor, Malaysian University of Science and Technology. And we also have Professor Tan Sri, Dr. Noor Azlan, who's also the Executive Director of Economic Action Council and former Vice-Chancellor of Universiti Kebangsaan. So maybe I'll start with Dr. Suraya. What will be your take on the outlook and also the implications of the budget, and how is it, how will we fare 2022 within the context of the 12th Malaysia Plan? Dr. Suraya.
Thank you, Prof. Norma. It's always a pleasure to be hearing from you, Prof. Norma. I'd like to thank KSI, Tan Sri Michael Yeo, for giving KRI the opportunity to speak today. I have some slides for today, Prof. Norma, so I'll start sharing. Oh, someone has started sharing, so that's even better. So I am very much, what is the word? Motivated by Tan Sri Muhyiddin's speech just now, whereby he mentioned the role of history in understanding where we've been and what policies have worked, and how that could then be pedoman, or how best do we then strategize further for the 12 Nation Plan. It appears that sometimes what works, sometimes it's not continued, but what didn't work, sometimes we continue it for many reasons that I think as economists and sociologists we should unpack. Because what is the point of growth if it's not for the well-being and the increased living standards of households? So my discussion today not only looks into the economic recovery, but what has happened before and how it has impacted households. And from that baseline, how do we ensure household will benefit from growth? So it's beyond GDP numbers, beyond this 5%, 6% growth rate, but more of, did we actually felt well-being descended down to households? Next. So here, I'd like to give a little bit of preamble in terms for the growth of 2022, the role of the state, the role of firms, and later I'll go into what has been the impact, as mentioned before, to households. Now, government have intrinsic duties to its citizens, namely safeguarding the citizen's survival and physical security, and the citizens' rights to socio-economic well-being. The COVID-19 pandemic threatens all of the above, and therefore we have seen not just Malaysian government, but all governments across the world struggling for far-reaching government intervention that has become a necessity to help bail out and help shoulder and shield both firms and household. It is one of the worst phenomenon that we've witnessed, I mean, within my lifetime, for me, and I'm sure for most as well. And we've not seen such intervention from government as it is now. And I think that's a very important take, or basically structural background to really ensure that we understand that the role of the state is very much needed in terms of recovery. Now, the role of firms, so here I'll go back a little bit into history. Left to its own devices, innovation will not flourish in firms, as was and is currently the case for Malaysia. When we look at some empirical evidence, most of the rentier economy, rather than channel back their retained profits to innovation or R&D, most firms either give back to shareholder, or they actually still, in Malaysia, rely on low-cost, low-skill business model. And this has worked in some industries, but of course, to the detriment of well-being of our citizens, because wages have been stagnating. Now, many other economies have had the benefit of government acting as entrepreneurial state. We have not done that yet. We are still in the developmental state. But in the entrepreneurial state, the government spearhead innovation with large-scale government-funded research and development. Why is it important? Because when government helps certain industries, these innovations spill over the domestic supply chains, which enables individual firms to capitalize on the general improved technology and privatize the gains. Of course, there's a quid pro quo here. Once the government helps you, you cannot privatize the gains. You must also help forward or backward linkages, and that would be domestic supply chains. The logical progression would be firms that are better prepared for the new global value chains post-pandemic, since its current practices are already are already at the required international standards. So this is the approach that we think would be more suited for the current growth strategy. And I would like to then bring the audience today to the previous years of actually doing this in certain sectors. Next. Now, most people, most international agencies always say, let's have a blind sector policies. But maybe sometimes we can have a hybrid. We can have blind sector policies for certain industries, but we can also have sector-specific policies for some. This is the latest by Libidu, Lee, and Petroboli in 2022, where they have shown the outcome of Malaysia's industrial policy in the 80s and 90s. So it spread across a few Malaysian plans, which is very important, this continuity. If I were to recap what Tan Sri Muhyiddin mentioned just now, continuity and confidence. If investors believe that there is continuity in the policies for certain sectors, and that even with a tectonic political environment, policies will still be continued. This is something that is very important for any business or any industry. So if we look at our, I'll give three, but I suggest everybody, we thought that this was one of the best narrative of looking into our resource-based policy in Malaysia so far by this very good fellow, I think he's an academic from LSE. And his PhD was on Malaysia, but he also made some, with his colleagues, a comparison with Chile on how Malaysia could escape the middle income trap. But what it showed between the petroleum and the palm oil and rubber industries, that there were key policies institutionalized by the government towards value addition in the commodity sectors in Malaysia. And it was in the fiscal incentives, in the trade promotion and protection, R&D support, and even human capital. I would like to just choose one, maybe rubber. So they had fiscal incentives for reinvestment in resource-based industries. So you have to reinvest in R&D, which include pioneer status, investment tax allowance. And for trade promotion, Malaysian Rubber Export Promotion Council promotes local products and identifies new opportunities in terms of R&D support. This is just selective, there's more if you read the paper. Rubber R&D Board, the MRB. The MRB was created from a merger of Rubber R&D Board, Rubber Research Institute, Rubber Exchange and Licensing Board. So a culmination of many agencies and institutions set up by the government in order to ensure that this industry is getting the support that it needs, as well as ensuring that the ecosystem, for example, you have many other industries that has used rubber as its main product. For example, we have Top Glove and other, of course, our wonderful condom, industry as well. But the point being is that once one thing is strengthened, then other ecosystem will be strengthened as well. So this then was captured by these researchers in the RCA, Reveal Comparative Advantage. Next. So having some regional and global players, what does it mean for the employment share? So this is what I meant by having a trade industry policy, but did it really create the employment share or the income that we wanted? But before that, let's look into the share of employment from 1920s to 2018. This was a graph done by my colleague, Alan, who's now in SC, from his paper, An Uneven Future, when he was still in KRI. But we added some other numbers as well. But if you look at the industry, you can see that basically when people say, manufacturing is really not strong, or we should go to services. I think the big key takeaway to take from this employment share is that most of the agriculture share went to services, and that's very interesting, because the industry that has seemed to be creating a value added is the blue portion, and yet less people are in it. Maybe, of course, due to the fact that with technology and productivity, you don't need that many workers. So we see this outcome, but we see a lot of people going into services. Next. So this has created this sort of rate of growth in household income. But just to also understand why maybe it is moderated, because SMEs, as all of us know, comprise of 97.2% of all of all business establishments in 2020. And this is not just because of 2020, of course, it was earlier than that. The largest SME employment share is in the services sector, as mentioned before, followed by manufacturing, agriculture, construction, mining, quarrying. More importantly, the service sector provided 48% of overall employment in the labor market, but only 38.2% of GDP. So in the service sector, it is very difficult to have, in the service sector, it is very difficult to have different types of to even do a complex investment in these sectors because of the scale, the nature of the business in services, also in SME. Therefore, this big help from the government in terms of investment and innovation in investment needs to be thought up in a very precise and understanding the needs of SMEs, because the big 12 nation plan, 11 nation plan, 10 nation plan of looking at sectors in services industry will not work. Next. Now, having all that, this is a study that I was involved in as well with Gregory Ho and Hawati in KRI. So looking on the trajectory of development, what has been the outcome to households? Not good. So we did basically looking into HIES 2014 data, not just income, but what you can consume with that income. And we did an equivalence income scale. So when we talk about B40, M40, T20, sometimes we give a connotation that B40 is poor, M40 is middle class, T20 is the elite, the affluent. But looking into the consumption patterns and the income of the 2014 HIES, KRI has shown, and you can read our report, that 20%, approximately 20% are the poor, merely satisfying basic needs in terms of consumption, because that's what their income can purchase. Food, clothing, housing. Vulnerable is 50%. This is not your middle class. This is not your middle class. What differentiates them from the poor is that they consume more varieties of food and purchase more household utensils. So we even saw, because we got really granular data from DOSM, that if you have a bit more, what families in this 50% do is that they beli KFC for one meal extra. So that's how dire it is. After all the Malaysian plans that we have done, this is the outcome. This group experiences a spectrum trade-offs in consumption, and they are vulnerable to economic shocks. So if there is a tire pancit, a puncture in your tires going to balik kampung, that's it. There you go for a month or two. And if there is basically, so you know what economic shocks is, I don't have to give examples. Now, the middle class, those who can insulate themselves from the economic shocks are only the 30% in our income distribution. So only 30% are middle class, and of course the top tier. Exhibit traits of the middle class, invest in own social mobility. They can actually do piano lessons, and they can insulate themselves from adverse risk. And I mean, number 3, signal class, but I put it quote unquote because we're still looking for the middle class in Malaysia. I'm involved in that study as well in KRI. So once we have more on that, we can elaborate more. However, the point is, in order to sustain demand, as Prof. Norma mentioned just now, you must have a lot of middle class, but currently it's not. Now, so when the pandemic hits and people are saying the M40 goes down to B40, well, the distribution is the same. The actual point of the matter is the purchasing power due to the existing baseline that they are vulnerable to begin with, but that made things even worse. Next. So how do we help people, quote unquote, help people in order to make sure they can still live well? So we give them credit. So this is the financialization of our lives. Now, would you be surprised that it's happening in Malaysia? By the demarcation that I showed you the previous slide, you wouldn't be. But this is what the question we always pose in KRI, and we hope more researchers will pose this question. What is the point of being wealthy if our households are not benefiting from the country's wealth? The household debt as share of GDP on the left-hand side, it has grown 7-fold. You can see this. I mean, many other agencies do this. I mean, Bank Negara has done this quite a lot. In fact, there was some figures from Bank Negara saying that basically most households can't sustain even 3 months of overhead if they are out of work, meaning most households don't have savings to cover 3 months of all their credit and financial burden. So this is a worrying trend for Malaysia. Next. So Build Back Better. So we've been hearing a lot about Build Back Better, but if you look at my previous slides, not to start on such a sober note and dreadfully bad time for 2022, but I think we can learn a lot from ensuring that once we protect and shield both firms and household. Sorry, this is a skeleton that I conceptually I was thinking about it, and I wanted to show that there are points where government can be very not absent, but there are points when government can pull away from their help, and firms and households can benefit from maybe the role of the state being less. But in terms of improving living standards, I think this is when we believe very strongly that the retreat of the state is not possible, especially in education, especially in health. So we believe that more spending should go into health and education. However, that spending must be into the content of this sector rather than just building the physical built form. So I think there is an interesting conundrum here to ensure that some of the development expenditure is done in such a way that it improves the living standards properly of citizens. And when we talk about build better, I think we need better workers, therefore better paid workers and better pay. Because without having that theme into our build better, I think we will go back to what we have seen into our household demarcation. that I've showed in the previous 2 slides, whereby 70% of population are in a vulnerable state. That was even before the pandemic. I will share this. I mean, all of you can have this paper, and I'm writing a paper on this Build Back Better. Hopefully, we'll publish soon. Next. So within the plan of the budget, as well as the 12th Malaysian Plan, I think most importantly, the theme would be to expand incomes and raising the standard of living. The creation of wealth. I mean, if we have just 2%, 4%, it's fine. It's not an end, but simply a means. So we have to ensure that living standards are taken care of and incomes are being properly adjusted for a better standard of living. Therefore, we have to really migrate from having low-cost, low-skill business model to better business model of ensuring profits are invested back into the firm for capital development and human development. I would want to ask in this forum, how many firms actually train their staff to ensure that the skills are being enhanced rather than outsource that to the government? I think it's high time that we look into ourselves and see how we can shape the society that we want. The value of raising the standard of living lies not just in the concrete improvements in how individuals live, but it shapes the social, political, and ultimately the moral character of a people. We have seen so many bad developments of the built form as well, where you build on land that is not to be built, where you cut hills, when you pollute rivers. These are all development that has not been punished by the government. So some people are saying that we should have preventive measures in terms of ensuring that natural capital is being put into all the business proposal. However, that implies that natural capital can be substituted with financial capital. But if it takes that to put natural capital in to make sure that people actually speak about it when they do development, then I think it can be used in that type of discussion. But understanding that natural capital cannot be supplanted by any other capital. And then lastly, we need to spread wealth as a matter of economic consequence. People say this is a matter of making it more equal, but it is also about ensuring that we have a broader base of people consuming very good goods, therefore that we can have a better standard of living. I think that's it from me, Prof. Norma. I hope I've not intruded on the other panelists' time. Thank you very much.
No, it's a pleasure, listening to you and the work at KRI. We are always excited with what KRI is working on. Yeah. So what struck me was the slide on the revealed comparative advantage. I think many of us have seen that. But what that slide showed also is that how little did we work on capitalizing and development on our the resource-based agricultural resource-based industries, the backward and forward linkages, and the value add are mainly in the manufacturing, petroleum, even manufacturing, really it is minimal, the R&D and value add is found elsewhere, not necessarily in Malaysia, although it forms a big percentage of our export. Now, the other point that you've made is also the challenges faced by the middle class. And I did not mention at the beginning of our panel that the other challenge that we're facing is inflation. Yeah? So US, Europe, and everywhere is talking about inflation could lead to another crisis. And so that will be interesting. However, I do not want to derail the discussion. So it'd be a pleasure to listen to Dr. Geoffrey Williams. Again, it's an honor to have you on the panel, Professor Williams. Yeah. So I'm sure there are a lot of insights there as well, and forecasts. Yeah. But what's interesting about Professor Williams is that, like Suraya, I think we're going to hear not just about growth, but also about distribution. Yeah. So over to you, Geoffrey. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure, as always, Prof. Norma, to be with you. Thanks to KSI for inviting me. Thanks to Tanshri Michael. I only have 10 minutes, so what I'd like to do is to go straight into the slides, if I may. It's a nice blue ocean picture to make us look all calm this morning. Let's look at the first slide. If you go to the first slide, I want to just take a look at the economic outlook for 2022. In order to understand where we are this year, 2022, and where we might go in 2023, we need to look back at what has happened over the course of the last 2 years, particularly during the lockdowns. So in this picture here, the solid blue line is the actual GDP level quarterly in real terms, seasonally adjusted. And that's basically the level of GDP. And as we know, we've had a pretty rough time since March of 2020 because of the lockdowns. The dotted red line, this is the trend rate of growth. This is where we could have been had there not been any form of intervention because of the COVID. And the dotted blue line is our forecast, just to understand that picture there. Well, what can we say about the impact of let me put it like this. The impact that we have experienced over 2020 and 2021 is an impact of policy. It's not an impact of the virus. It's an impact of the response, the policy response. So what can we say has been the impact of the policy response, particularly through the lockdowns? Well, the lockdowns in 2020 and 2021 have taken GDP down to levels that we had actually in 2018, at the end of 2018. And despite what was forecast at the beginning of 2020 or even at the beginning of 2021, and indeed what is being forecast now, which are very similar forecasts by the World Bank and Bank Negara and so on. In 2020, the forecasts were 6 to 7%, or 2021, 5 to 6%. Now it's 5.5 to 6.5%. Despite these forecasts, actually the outturns were very much worse than that. And we know that the impact of the lockdowns has taken GDP to levels below the levels we had in 2018. We still have not recovered the levels that we had before the pandemic. And according to our forecasts, we're not going to recover to that level until at least the end of this year, and probably into the second quarter of next year, 2023. So although we are of the view that this year we should be seeing growth for sure, we don't see that the growth will be as optimistic as is being predicted by the international forecasters and also by Bank Negara. We see that growth will be probably around 3.5% or something for this year. And the main reasons for that are that there has been a very significant impact of the lockdown policies. And these have affected all aspects of the domestic economy. We have seen average wages and median wages falling. We have seen millions of people lose their job, and either they have moved into unemployment, where we've seen unemployment rise by hundreds of thousands, or they have moved into underemployment, where they will still have some form of work, but it will be on lower hours, for example, time-related underemployment, or it will be on skills-related underemployment, where they're not being paid according to the type of qualifications and income levels that they had before. We have seen tens of thousands of companies closing, and these are not just zombie companies that would have closed anyway. These are actual successful vibrant going concerns that have been unable to sustain through the extended lockdowns. Tens of thousands of companies have closed. They will not reopen quickly. We have seen a continuation of the decline in net foreign direct investment, which has been in decline since 2016. We have seen a continuation in the decline of domestic investment as a proportion of GDP, which has also been in trend decline for many years. And of course, all of this has been exacerbated during the lockdown period. And taking all of these things together, in addition, of course, we have seen, as we saw just from the previous presentation, we have seen consumer debt rising, household debt rising, household savings falling, EPF accounts have been depleted significantly. So all of these things taken together have had a significant structural effect on the economy. And because of this structural effect, we do not see that there is going to be a significant rebound during this year. We see growth, but we see it as being much more muted and really rather tentative and fragile. If we see an increase in the number of cases due to Omicron, which is almost certain, and we see a policy response which is too harsh in response to that increase in cases, then unfortunately we risk the possibility of repeating what happened in 2020 and 2021, which is we start the year quite optimistically with relatively high levels of growth forecast, but then in the end we wind up with the economy having been contracted because of the lockdowns, and then we don't see that. So we don't see those forecasts materializing. Now, for us, if we have a relatively open response to the COVID crisis during this year, and we start to see an increasing relaxation and complete removal of all of the restrictions, then we will start to see some tentative recovery of about 3.5%. Next year, 2023, we will see hopefully the economy recovering to a new level of underlying potential growth. And later I want to mention the effect that this structural change has had on underlying potential growth. So we see that underlying potential growth will have fallen to about 4.3%, and we will return to that during 2023. And we will see this persistent underemployment, which unfortunately now has become structural. When we look at the data about labor force participation, and we look at the data of the number of people who are underemployed, we're seeing that there was a problem with that before the crisis, but unfortunately the crisis has impacted that even more, and it's become structural. Now, in the table in the bottom of this slide, you can see our estimates of what has been the impact in economic terms, in money terms, of the lockdown. And this is calculated based on the difference between the actual outturn or our forecast and where we would have expected the economy to be had there not been the COVID impact. And you can see that the impact has been really quite heavy. Roughly about anywhere between 13 and 16% of GDP over the actual period 2020, 2021, and the forecast period up to 2023. Cumulatively, something like 792 billion ringgit in economic losses, which is actually about, roughly speaking, is almost half of an annual GDP level. So that's a measure of the economic impact in aggregate terms. Of course, we know that the economic impact in household terms, the economic impact in individual terms, and the economic impact in distributional terms has all been worse. And the structural impact has also been very significant. And we now have some very significant structural issues. Underemployment is a very significant structural issue. Of course, pensions are a very significant structural issue. We know the data from EPF and what they are suggesting, which is as many as 3/4 of their members will be underfunded or have inadequate pensions. Our estimates are that it's about 85% of the total adult population, because we know that there is a significant number of people who are not involved in any form of formal pension at all, including the EPF. So our estimate is that about 85% of the adult population have insufficient pension coverage. Let's look at the next slide. You mentioned the issue of inflation, Norma, so I'm going to speak about inflation. There has been some discussion recently in the newspapers about inflation. If we look at the black line on the graph, the black line is the headline inflation. And that's the one we often look at most often. It's the CPI, the percentage change annual terms. And we can see it's really been quite volatile. During 2020, we were actually in a period of quite significant deflation measured using CPI. But we know why that is. This is the issue. I mean, we understand why that is. And there have been three particular issues that have affected the inflation figure. The most important is the oil price, which is outside of the control of the government, it's determined internationally. And that's caused a big chunk of that increase in inflation in the early part of 2021. The second has been the impact of the lockdown, particularly on supply chains, and the effect that has had, especially in terms of food. That's clearly something that is quite important. And the third has been various effects of policies, because various policies in terms of price controls and the impact, the introduction of various price controls and the removal of various price controls has also affected the headline inflation figures. Now we know that these are the factors that are affecting headline inflation, because if we take these factors out and look at inflation excluding fuel and core inflation, we can actually see that inflation is really quite modest. And that although there is some variation in both of those measures, inflation excluding fuel and core inflation, nonetheless, inflation is relatively low on both of those measures. We can also see that contrary to what some people are saying, that we might be expecting higher inflation in the future, actually we are seeing inflation on a downward trend. In all, certainly in terms of headline inflation, it's definitely lower now than it was. For example, in April of last year, it was 4.7%, so it's clearly lower. Now, we expect that this type of downward trend will continue. We expect that core inflation will fall to around 1.6%. It might rise slowly, but this is more of a convergence issue, but it will remain below 2% by the end of 2022. The headline inflation figure will be very volatile, but again, it's going to be much lower than it has been during 2021. We expect it to be sort of normal, around 2%, a little bit below 2%. Now, there is a concern, of course, about the impact of inflation, particularly on people with fixed incomes, people in lower income groups, and of course, people whose incomes are falling, and of course, particularly people in the much more precarious employment environment, the underemployed. And of course, this is a very important and very pressing issue. Now, rather than follow the advice of some people, which is to say that the risk of higher inflation would suggest that we need higher interest rates or we need contractions in government spending, our view is that either of those things would be a disaster at this stage, because we feel that the recovery process, whilst it's underway, it is really quite fragile. And our view is that reintroducing or introducing further price controls, and particularly a utility subsidy, would help actually to moderate even the headline inflation figure. And that, if it was introduced immediately, it could actually have quite a significant effect on helping to moderate price levels. And it would also have significant social effects, because it would help to reduce the utility bills of people in lower income groups. And also it's relatively cost-free, because this is an effect that can be borne by the energy companies. It's not something that has to be paid for by the government. So just to address that issue of inflation, we are less concerned about the prospect of higher inflation than some other people, and we certainly do not believe that we need to have a period of austerity or higher interest rates in order to control it. So let's look at the next slide. Okay, implications of budget 2022. Well, budget 2021 was quite an interesting budget for me because I wrote an article with my partner on this issue, and we described this as an ordinary budget for extraordinary times, the 2021 budget. And actually, Anwar used that phrase in Parliament to describe the budget of 2021. Now, the budget of 2022, although it is, as we heard before, it is a record budget, 332 billion ringgit. To me, it still is a relatively ordinary budget, and I'll just explain a little bit why I mean that. Although it's much bigger, when it is a record budget, it is nonetheless a relatively straightforward budget. Firstly, the increase is only around 3%, and since there is some inflation, the real terms increase in the budget is actually not that big. If we look at the increase of the extra 9.6 billion between 2021 and 2022, and we do some very simple calculations on a per capita basis and a monthly basis, we find out that actually that increase is only worth 24 ringgit per person per month. And so in that sense, it's not a particularly expansive budget. I would point out, however, that the budget allocation for Bumiputra, the special allocation for Bumiputra, the Bumiputra group, does come out at almost twice that level of 24 ringgit per person. For the Bumiputra, it's more like 50 ringgit per person per month. Now, some people might have some questions as to why that is, but my particular perspective is that actually the Bumiputra have been a group of people who have been hit hardest by some of the impact of the lockdown. Certainly, if we look at the EPF withdrawals, for example, that would indicate that this group has actually faced some really quite difficult issues there. So taking the budget together, it didn't really have a feel of a growth budget in particular, nor did it have the appearance of a pre-election budget. Whether it was designed as a pre-election budget or not, I don't know. Whether we will see another pre-election stimulus, I don't know. But I didn't see that in the budget in 2022. Instead, we had a very similar, same old approach, a very long list of special projects and programs for particular groups, and most of these programs are very small, and we are often not sure about how these programs or how these budgets, how these allocations are actually made, whether they get to the intended recipient, and we unfortunately still don't have a particularly good way of understanding the impact of any of these individual programs. This is one of the reasons why I have recommended that there should be an independent fiscal institution in Malaysia to help us to understand the impact of budgetary decisions in a much more forensic way, and reporting directly to the public and reporting directly to Parliament. But we don't have that here, like we have, for example, in the United Kingdom under something called the Office for Budgetary Responsibility. Nonetheless, there were some highlights in budget 2022. We were very pleased to see allocations for SMEs, particularly some interest-free grants. These are the type of things that we have been recommending. Our preference, that is myself and my colleague Paulo Casadillo, our preference is for direct, universal and unconditional allocations. And the reason for that is that we feel that, for example, if we take the SME community, we feel that SMEs know best what is necessary for their businesses. And we feel that it's very difficult to say that some SMEs are more deserving than other types of SMEs. And it's also very difficult to say that SMEs need, for example, an e-commerce grant or a training grant, when actually what they need is 10,000 ringgit to help them pay for their stock, or help them pay for rebranding, or help them pay for their outstanding bills. So we are of the view that SMEs know best how to spend the money, and we're of the view that that type of direct grant is much more effective than the targeting approach that's often taken in budgets. So we're very glad to see that. We're also very glad to see that the Welfare Department has now properly adjusted the the food poverty figure, 1,169 ringgit, although one also needs to understand the implications of that, particularly, for example, when we look at minimum wages, for example, minimum wages are only 1,200 ringgit a month. And what that means is that it indicates that various other forms of welfare assistance or welfare protection are actually perhaps not moving in line with across the system as a whole. And this to us signals something which is quite important, which was not particularly addressed in the budget, but perhaps we will talk about it in the next slide when we talk about the Malaysia plans, for example, which is that one of the key things that has been highlighted by the impact of the extended COVID period is the absence of an effective social safety net in Malaysia and a lack of coordination across different departments offering different types of support, and a need for us to review that very systemically and very seriously, and to bring some new ideas to how that first can be designed and then how it can be structured, and of course how it can be funded. For example, some of the projects that we see on an ad hoc basis don't necessarily fill the gap. So there's an example for the EPF initiative for those in the informal sector, for example, is worth only 7.90 ringgit per person employed in that sector. So although it might look generous and it will be announced as an important initiative, actually, when you do some very simple calculations on a per capita basis, you find that the amounts that are being given out are really relatively small. So that's our view basically on the budget. Will it be a growth budget? Not particularly. We don't think. Could it be improved in terms of its overall structure and removing these lists, this long laundry list of targeted projects? Yes, we think that there are better ways of dealing with it. So perhaps we can look at the last slide.
Geoffrey, I hate to do this, but we're running late. Okay,
well let me finish quickly. Okay. So will the Malaysia plan deal with these issues? That's the question we've been asked. One might say it's not the budget's responsibility. It's not the responsibility of the budget to deal with these issues. Will the Malaysia plan deal with these issues? Well, the discussions that we've had are really drawing on the Malaysia plan, which we had to wait for. The question is, what is the government's plan? Because we have multiple plans from different sources, and it isn't particularly clear that these plans are aligned, and some of them appear to be competing with each other. So there is, if you like, an overabundance of different types of plans. We also need to look at what is the target for these plans in terms of growth, and whether these growth targets are realistic. For example, the target for the Malaysia plan is 4 to 5.5% growth, but actually even Bank Negara and the World Bank, and of course our own analysis that I just explained, is suggesting that those types of levels of growth might be unachievable. And the Malaysia plan raises some issues, which is a much more fundamental and philosophical issue about the role of government. And should the government be doing these plans? Should the government be having these plans? Or should we have a completely different approach based on liberalizing markets, privatization, making space for the private sector, promoting entrepreneurism, freeing up opportunities for people to create their own income sources.
We'll have to interrupt you again, Geoffrey. I'm so sorry. Okay. Yeah, because we have Noor Azlan, and we're supposed to end at 9:45, so it's 9:40 now. 9:40.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, yeah. Okay. So let me just summarize. Basically, there is a structural shift. There's the lockdowns have had a structural effect, and the question I think now is whether the Malaysia plans are able to help us to deal with those structural impacts or not. That's a real persistent question that we need to try to answer.
Thank you very much, Geoffrey. Okay. Thank you. So I would now just invite Noor Azlan. Apologies, we don't I hope the organizers will give us some time. Yeah, can we extend? I know Azlan is supposed to do 10 minutes and supposed to be Q&A after. Yeah, so I leave it to the organizers, Tan Sri Michael. But please, can we listen to Tan Sri Azlan? Please go ahead, Tan Sri.
Thank you, Prof. Dato Norma and Dr. Suraya and Prof. William. The fear of being the last speaker is two things. One is that everything that you want to say, someone said it, or the other one is that you only have 3 minutes to do it. Okay, never mind. I think the organizer will still give me the time. Let me just put it very quickly. I think I'm glad that Dr. Suraya and Prof. William has already given some background to it. But let me put my thoughts in terms of how Malaysia want to move forward. Move next. Now, the challenge is recovery versus reforms. You know, I mean, in many cases, we tend to look at recovery as the growth rates that we are going to get or secure next year or this year, right? And in many cases, we forgot that there is a side of reforms. Growth and structure has to come together. Actually, we can create growth very easily. I mean, just give all the bonuses to the public civil officers, give us holidays, spending will go up, growth will go up. But if it is not associated with a structural reform, trust me, it will lead to more disasters. I heard a Minister of Human Resource now in Indonesia. You can bring another 3 million foreign workforce here. You can get good growth next year or this year, but that is not in line with what we want. So we don't want to miss this out, that recovery must come with reform. So I would like to just look at 2021. I mean, move on. 2021. You know, if we flash back 2021, this is how it looks like. To the point that if we really want to give marks to all the people who are forecasting for 2021, probably all of them failed by now. Well, after all, we know that 2021 is a VUCA year. It's a very volatile, uncertain. The fact that there is a pandemic rising in the beginning of the year, and you start to see that things are being revised down and down and down and down. In August, somewhere in August, Fitch Solutions was saying that growth for Malaysia is 0%. And before that, they are saying it's 10%. If you follow Fitch Solutions, news, earlier on, they were saying that 2021 will be 10%, but then it revised to 0% and then to 1.5%. So this is the nature of growth that we are looking at. And now the latest is basically, we all know the numbers. Go ahead, follow. You see the numbers for 2022. I don't want to debate so much about all these numbers because I believe that numbers per se are not telling. Are we progressing? Are we really creating a sustainable growth path for Malaysia? Let's look a bit more longer. This is just a reality picture. Before the crisis, this is what is projected. I remember very well when the budget was announced in 2019 for 2020, before there is COVID. So that is where we are projected. So take this as the path which is in our mind before. But then we have a crisis. So crisis bring it down all the way to 1.34 trillion ringgit Malaysia in real terms. And you can see that actually it take the nation back to even before 2019. In April, IMF projected that, the news come out and said, I remember that it was well celebrated in somewhere when we are facing COVID in the first round. IMF was saying that you're going to get a growth of 9% in 2021, and that will be the highest in Southeast Asia. So at that point, people were celebrating 9% is going to be a great year for 2021. And if the big if is not happening, if it goes there, that is only about 2.2% from the original path. So do not get confused with all these big numbers, because when you come from a low base, then the rate will be different. So what is that in 2021? This is what you get now. The maximum, now it's 3 to 4%. It will take us there. And assuming 2022, going at 6.5% at the highest range, we will go back to 1.48 trillion ringgit. And that is actually lower, slightly lower than what we are projecting way back in 2019, about what we should be by end of 2020. So the reason I want to caution this is that all these numbers, the percentage numbers that you are seeing, sometimes can be very tricky in terms of understanding that. But most important thing, in real terms, where are we? So if truly we are able to get 6.5% this year, then it means that we are just barely at the range of what we are targeted in 2020, about 2021. Okay, next. Let me take you way back to 30 years. The challenge is, what is the growth, the right growth for Malaysia? What we are seeing, the momentum is going down. But that does not necessarily mean we are on the wrong path. You know, back in the early 90s, we know that we are growing at around 7% or even 8%, 9% sometimes. But then in the second 10 years, it goes 4.6 and now 4.0. And for RMK12, it's targeting at 4.5 to 5.5%. One that you have to remember is that going back to around 7, 8, 9%, like in the 90s, might be something which is not only impossible, but it's not right. Remember that the economy has grown a lot. I mean, back in the 90s to 2000, we are at the size of economy is about 80 billion, and now it's 350 billion. Just because the size of the economy is bigger, the growth rate to achieve 1% is no longer the same. So we need to give a fair understanding of what is the right growth for Malaysia. Now let's look very quickly in terms of income for the last 30 years. I don't want to go too much detail into this, but if we measure this, look at the blue line from somewhere in the middle, you see that we are closing the gap. The red line basically is the high income nation gap, and we are now, on my calculation, about 17% behind. Honestly, if we do nothing, I think even if we do normal things, I mean, things will, I believe that it will close that range by 2025. But the problem is that all what we want? I think what Suraya raised is right, that interestingly, we have not discussed, but Suraya raised exactly what I want to raise, is that we need to think beyond GDP. Move on. Then you start to see that, even if you flash back Vision 2020, everything qualitative around us, honestly, when I put question mark, what it means is that, honestly, we have never paid much attention to it, and now we have a lot of difficulties around that. And if we look at some of the inside the box, what you see for the last 30 years. Now, I just want to go to quick on this. On the left is complexity. What Suraya do, the RCA has to do a lot. How sophisticated is our economy? What you see, the red line is almost flat. Luckily, we are not too far. I mean, we are in the same range. But if we look at Vietnam, if we look at Philippines, if we look at Thailand, Thailand has a cross above us now. This is about technological sophistication, our ability to produce complex products. And you see down there the deterioration in competitiveness, remarkable. I mean, deteriorations in the business environment. The dot charts basically shows that 9 states are actually falling behind. So while the economic growth macro-wise is going up, but economy is falling behind, and highly, I mean, a serious problem of not able to produce the right jobs. We have a lot of skill-related unemployment. And when I look at some of the recent data on, just look at the My Future Job portal, this is only that portal, it shows that, job created and job demanded are not in balance. I mean, our employers are still, the economy is still relying on the old kind of jobs. So we are talking about sustainable growth, we are talking about recovery which is sustainable, we need to really look inside the box. And finally, basically, I mean, maybe just a simple illustrations. Imagine that someone on this super bike, do we have the right talents, the right riders of the economy? Who are the drivers of economy? Is it filled up with a foreign workforce, unskilled? Is it filled up with non-tertiary kind of jobs? What kind of infrastructure that we have? Tan Sri Mahyudin talked about digitalizations. What is the connectivity in Malaysia? To what extent that digitalization now is being employed in all economic and also social activities? If we are talking about modernization, technology, innovation, are we riding on the so-called economy that is relying on technology and innovation? And again, we look at the environment, the rules and regulation, and the most important thing on the right side is the government who are giving instructions where to go, what to do, and also to put a lot of things that probably will determine at the end of it the ease of doing business. These are the drivers of growth. I think we need to seriously focus on this, spend a little bit less in terms of the growth rate per se. By simply opening up the economy, by simply allowing people back on the highway, by simply removing all these, closure, MCO, and so on, trust me, we're going to get some growth. But the challenge that we are facing is it a quality growth? That is what Suraya is asking. Thank you, Suraya, for raising this, because I think the nation must be thinking about this. Do not be overdosed with looking at the growth rates. Luckily we have been growing at the growth rates, which is about 5.3% for the last 30 years. But please bear in mind, our inside the box items are very weak, and we need that to be on highest priority. And finally, basically, this is end of last year. The secretariat, I led the team who are involved in rounds of workshops and so on. We passed this document to Prime Minister. This is a semi-official document, resetting Malaysia, and most of the recommendations is about fixing the drivers. And with that, I hope that maybe this will be on the EPU link, and hopefully that we can have more discussion on that. So thank you very much, Dato' Norma, and I think that's all my presentation.
Thank you. That was very succinct. Yeah, very rich, but within a short, less than 10 minutes, I guess, or about 10 minutes. Yeah, but wonderful, because the organizers have asked us, or rather has given a green light that we can proceed until 11, so we can take questions. But what's interesting is that although there are different speakers, but finally, I think the main or the common theme among them is that although 2020 year term, but we should not focus just how we perform this year, but it should impact or have an effect on the structural challenges of the Malaysian economy. Yeah. So questions from the floor? Since we have like 5 minutes more before we close. There was an earlier question from Hidir Hamza. Yeah, I think this was addressed to Dr. Suraya, that maybe we can segregate the services sector, that everything is under services. Yeah, because it seems to be a high percentage, about 63%, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, so maybe Dr. Suraya wants to take that while we wait for more questions.
Thank you, thanks, Norma. Thank you. Yeah, so I don't understand whether he wants to segregate in terms of services, quality of the workforce, meaning is it more of low skill, managerial, or what we call modern services? But even in the way we collect data in DOSM, I hope DOSM is here, is that modern services is pegged to you being a manager or in the financial sector. So that doesn't really give a good input for us to read the data properly. So I think in the way in which we collect data sometimes inhibit what we can do with it. I think you have a discussion on how best do we slice the types of qualification and the types of job created and the types of how do you categorize which one is sophisticated, innovative, and which ones are not. That would be interesting for us to do more studies. However, having said that, I'm waiting for another question, but just having said that, I've never believed in macro analysis. So that's why when people ask me to do macro analysis, I'm hesitant, because I think that if you don't understand the sector, and what is sector if not a collection of firms, if you don't understand how firms operate, it's very difficult for us to do any meaningful analysis. So we do need to get more firm data, but firms are normally not that open to analysis as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Suraya. I'm not sure whether the organizers get any questions. If you do,
can I just add
sure,
on that, Norma? I think again, I mean, the question is valid because if we just like Suraya said, I mean, if we just take what is being reported now, that's what we will get. Probably even for Kelantan, it looks like the services is very high. Someone was saying that, oh, Kelantan and Perlis is already like OECD, which is wrong. I mean, what we need to do is to look at, I think, probably the complexity of the sector. I think that is more important than merely just cut off by agriculture and so on. There are countries that become great nation by doing agriculture alone. I mean, we need a more micro information firm level, as what Dr. Suraya was mentioning. I want to just, Prof. William, I just want to put some statement of kind of, a caution interpretation of what Prof. William put up just now. He mentioned about 9.6 billion that equal to 24 ringgit per month for Bumiputera. I don't think that is the right way of interpreting what is actually the impact because there are multipliers. You know, you build highways, but a lot of people will get benefit from it. So I don't want the media to misquote that, to think that the government only give 24 ringgit for each household of Bumiputera. I mean, we should not be dividing just like that. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to services, before I pass this to Professor Williams, that I think it is also whether it's tradable or non-tradable. Yeah, our services, whether is it for export or is it just local consumption. I think that's the other factor that we need to look at. Okay, I pass it to Geoffrey. Would you like to add to the discussion?
Well, I mean, just on the per capita issue, I do understand, yes, of course, there are multiplier effects, of course. But I think one needs always to look at these things from a different perspective. If you say it's a record budget and it's increased by 3%, and then you look at that, what that is on a per capita basis, it's not as big. Secondly, I think that the question of multipliers really does depend upon how this additional money is passed through into the economy. And as I mentioned, if it's passed through this long laundry list of projects, many of which don't come to fruition, then you don't actually get that multiplier effect. And so it's not just the total amount that we have to deal with, it's actually the way in which it's transmitted through the economy. And then this issue of services, I think one of the main concerns about services is, will they be resistant to future technologies? And will we be able to create high quality employment from these services? Or are these low quality, low value added, low paid service jobs in gig economy, for example, type work? And what will the effect of technology and demographic change and other megatrends be if we have such a high dependence on the service sector? We need to take a much longer look at that.
Yeah, thank you, Geoffrey. There are a few more questions here, and some of them are similar to what I'm about to ask the panelists, but we just can't make it. I'm a real poor manager of panel this time, unfortunately. So guess I may not invite me next time. However, I think the discussion can be extended to the next session. And my friend Nell is I think moderating the session, if I'm not mistaken, and the speakers are already here. So I will not summarize. I think I have summed up earlier that somehow, yeah, we are converging. The themes and issues that we're focusing on are converging. Yeah, it's not just for near term, but it's also about the structural issues, which I will have to mention this. I was working on the new economic model, and it was the same, because my question, Tan Sri Noor Azlan, was if she could share some highlights of what would be, the policies in order to work on our structural issues. But I think the structural issues remain the same, and the policies would be similar, yeah, to the new economic model in 2010 when we did it. So with that, I thank all the wonderful panelists. Yeah, thank you very much. I always enjoy listening to you and having interactions with all of you. And I pass on to the organizers. Yeah, thank you very much.